So welcome to this session of the Unite Partner Summit. This session is all about the 3 golden rules to deliver a better return on investment from Salesforce. So my name is Ian Gotts. I've been around the Salesforce ecosystem for about the last 20 years, from when Salesforce was just a small SFA application, and it's grown significantly since then. So delighted to be part of the Unite Partner Summit. So I know many people end up spending their time through presentations taking photographs of the slides. You only need to take a photograph of this one. That QR code will take you to the presentation deck and the resources that I'm going to be talking about as I go through the sessions. And as with all presentations, the safe harbor statement from Salesforce: please make decisions based on generally available technology and solutions. So this session is based on an article I wrote a while back, which was very popular. A number of people said that we should spend more time talking about it. And what we've done is we've tried to boil down the 3 golden rules for getting a better return on investment for you as partners, whether you're an SI or an ISV, as a partner working with your customers. And it boils down to 3 things. The first is doing better business analysis up front. So encouraging your clients, making sure that you get an opportunity to do better business analysis before you start building. Business analysis becomes before DevOps. That's true in both the implementation lifecycle, but if you check the dictionary, you'll also find that's true. Business analysis comes before DevOps and development. And the principle of business analysis is really building the right things first time, rather than rushing into build and then doing a ton of rework. And what we've identified is you can reduce rework by up to 80% if you actually do this business analysis correctly up front. And there's a concept called shift left, which means make sure you discover the bad news early. Let's make sure that we capture things in business analysis, in design, rather than capturing the problems in either build or worse when they make it to production. And we've also identified that even if you don't build anything, you could certainly identify 25% of process improvements just through the business analysis phase. And again, the article that I wrote, and there's a link at the end of this presentation, the article I wrote in fact has got some real life examples and some calculators, so you can start to identify for your customers where you can drive those improvements. And again, with each of these, I'll dig into a little bit more detail. The second is better understanding about the visibility of changes, X-ray vision of your org configuration. So again, we've identified that it increases the risk if you don't understand what's going to get broken when you make a change inside an org. Orgs are getting increasingly complex as we build bigger and bigger applications. So again, using some of the APIs that Salesforce is available, you can build some analysis which can reduce the discovery time by up to 50%. The time taken when you first arrive at a client. There's nothing worse, and I had 12 years as an Accenture partner. There's nothing worse than day 2 of the client having to explain the original costs that you put out, or the proposal is going to be 50% more, 30% more, because there are things that you didn't discover in the as you were going through the discovery phase. And then the other benefit of that is you can start to identify the risk of changes, and therefore you can pull forward simple changes, the easy low risk changes, so you can actually drive releases more quickly. In our own org, which is fairly complex, multiple systems, multiple integrations, we did 77 releases last year. 0 rollbacks. 77 releases, every single one of them stuck. So that's the second thing, which is applying some X-ray vision into your org. And the last is about documentation. We all need to make it easy. There is no later. People say, oh, I'll document that later. We all know that never happens. So how do we capture people in the moment and get them to do that documentation? And I want to talk about 4 ways that documentation gets created. Only one of them is hard. Some of it is easy. And that documentation feeds straight back into the org discovery or the impact analysis. If someone is writing a flow or has built some complex validation rule, documenting why you did it in the moment takes very little time. Going back 6 months later, trying to work out what happened takes an enormous amount of time. Often we don't do it, and that ends up breaking the org. And really the heart of all this is trying to get technical debt under control. We'll never stop it. Technical debt is always building, but we need to manage and control it. So there are the three concepts I want to talk about throughout this session. So the first is business analysis. And it's all about capturing requirements, validating those requirements with business process maps, and secondly, creating user stories. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about business analysis because there is a standard that's now being well defined across Salesforce, which is called UPN, Universal Process Notation. And this standard is not anchored in any bit of software. It's not proprietary to any company. It's been around about 20 years. In fact, its history starts back in the 1970s, 80s with SSADM. So it's been around a long time. Some very simple principles. A simple activity box called what happened, and it starts with a verb. Who is responsible? What systems are used? But then a trigger for when does it happen? And then an output about why does it happen? And then the beauty of this is we want to try and keep these diagrams relatively simple. Anyone who looks at a process diagram with 30, 40, 50, or 100 boxes, you stop looking at them. You need to keep it to 8 to 10 boxes so we can engage everyone in the audience, whether it's IT, business users, end users, compliance, or senior management. So keeping these diagrams relatively simple. And that really is where we get to this other point called the how, the drill down. Any activity box can drill down to the next level of detail. So we're building out a hierarchy of process diagrams. The other point about how there is maybe you can link supporting information. So it might be a link to a Salesforce screen, a link to a training document. So again, this content we're building should be very easy to engage our end users. And the reason we want to do that is clearly we want to drive out what they really need, not what they thought they wanted. When I said about business analysis being done properly up front, what I mean is we really need to bottom out exactly what the customers, our end users, really need, so we can then build the systems that they want. If we rush straight into build before we really understand, quite often we have poor adoption. And we're seeing this time and time again in terms of the companies we're looking at where they haven't done business analysis. The level of adoption is relatively low. So let me just talk about this UPM standard in a bit more detail. There is training material out there. The Partner Learning Camp has a detailed process mapping course you can find if you look at business process mapping. There are some trailhead courses. There is also a more detailed trailhead course coming out at Trailhead DX, I believe. And work in progress, there's a business analysis certification. So Salesforce is doubling down in terms of giving people the support around business analysis, which is fantastic. Again, I've been on my hobby horse probably since 1986 about the importance of business analysis and the benefits it can give you. So if we just look at a typical diagram, here is a high-level diagram for everything from lead to commission. So this is the whole of the sales cycle. You can see it's only about 8 or 10 boxes, and even I can understand this. But critically, you can see that there are activities starting with verbs. Every line has text on it. If you don't have a line and you don't have text, then you've no idea when an activity is finished. And actually, I remember talking to a senior guy at Toyota who said, the lines are the important thing. Everybody knows how their bit of the process works, but it's the handoffs. When is a lead qualified? If marketing thinks that a lead qualified is when they scan someone at an event, whilst sales think a qualified lead is when someone's about to purchase. Again, we need to be clear in our own organizations what that is. As consultants, you need to bottom that out with your customers. And it's often they are the most difficult conversations to have, but they actually is where the real gold dust is. So any one of these could drill down to the next level of detail. So we're now at create lead, and we could keep on going down and down until we get to the level of detail where there is no ambiguity. The other thing is business analysis is not just process maps. We can link these business processes to a user story. You can link it to a requirement. That user story could be linked to the metadata items that are going to get changed. So don't think about process maps and requirements and user stories in isolation. The power is when they're connected. When we start to see that this process step is going to change these metadata items because of this user story. And then the other thing we can link to an activity box is information that will be either captured in the workshop and it's useful as background material for our development team, screenshots of whiteboards, how a field needs to be completed. But also think about this process content as not being thrown away at the end of the project, but it actually is useful training material that can be embedded and used as training material for end users. And you could even embed a diagram inside a Lightning component or inside a Visualforce page, so end users benefit from all the work you did in terms of that analysis. So here we're starting to do the documentation for you. That documentation you're building at the front end immediately becomes valuable to the end users at the back end. And I think that's the power of this UPM standard. So a quick question came in that said, business analysis certification. This is a brand new certification. I'm afraid I can't tell you very much about it because it's still under NDA, but the early scoping work has been done. It's a brand new business analysis certification that covers the whole, not just process, but everything from capturing requirements, understanding the business, all the way through to user testing. And it will be a certification just like a Sales Cloud or a sales admin or a consultant certification. So that was talking about business analysis. And again, there's a lot more content in the resources that are attached at the end of the deck. Second area I wanted to look at was giving you X-ray vision into your org config. As I said at the beginning, if you use some more automated approaches, you can reduce the time it takes to do your org discovery as a consultant by up to 50%. And I think without any analysis, you run fast and fall often, or the other option is you walk slowly and stay safe. With a level of org analysis, you can run fast and stay safe, which means you can deliver quickly and you can be confident that you're not going to break anything. So I've got a session after this, in fact, which is called 10 Lessons from Analyzing Over 7 Billion Metadata Items. So Elements obviously is an application out there that does business analysis and org analysis. We've analyzed 7 billion metadata items. And we've been scared at the size of some of the orgs that we're now synchronizing and analyzing. And that scale and complexity increases risk massively. And I think it's now got to the stage where it's impossible to do this org analysis manually. The idea of bouncing around setup with a spreadsheet, trying to complete it and build an Excel spreadsheet is a lost cause. By the time you've completed one area of the business, there have been more changes and therefore your spreadsheet is out of date. And remember, we have some APIs here. We have the metadata API, we have the tools API, we have the dependency API. That is giving us a ton of insight that we can use to build automated analysis. And without that analysis, we're building up technical debt. And as it says there, technical debt kills agility. Talking to a customer the other day, they cannot make a change inside Salesforce for another 18 months because their level of technical debt means that they have to do a bunch of refactoring. They realize that that's what it costs because 18-year-old org, they've got to do that level of work to reduce the technical debt to a point where they can get the agility back that Salesforce gave them when they first started. And again, that's the reason we use Salesforce. Very powerful, very agile, but we need to manage that technical debt. So I want to give you just show you a couple of things in terms of what's possible with the if you use the metadata APIs. You can start to pull out every API, every bit of metadata out of the API and start to make sense of it. See there on the right-hand side, pulling out email templates, global actions. But we've built it into a tree structure, so it's very easy to navigate. Click on anything on the left-hand side, and we're starting to pull out the right-hand side in terms of what metadata information is out there. And again, the metadata APIs are very rich. They take a little bit of effort to make sure that they play fairly with some of these very big orgs to make sure that they pull the data out, but really powerful once you've got all that data out. So you could do, say this is at an object level, you could start to pull out, record counts by record type. You could start to look at field population. So how well populated are fields? How many times do you go to a customer and they say, oh, we've maxed out the account field, we can't put any more fields on there. Well, maybe most of those fields haven't been used. But again, if you don't know where they're used and if they've got data in them, it's very, very difficult to delete them with confidence. By the way, just because a field doesn't have data it doesn't mean you can necessarily delete it. Combine an understanding about data population with an understanding about where those fields are used, using the dependency API, suddenly you get a better picture about whether it's a risk to delete that field or remove it. So there is an idea about what you can build with the dependency API. The ability for a field or an Apex class or a dashboard, you can see where that field has dependencies. So whilst you thought you could just change the earned value field, I can now understand that there are multiple custom fields that depend on that. Again, really valuable as a consultant to be able to go back to the client when the client says, well, it can't be that hard. Why can't you just change the field? You've got a very visual picture about the amount of effort it's now going to take to do the analysis before you start making changes. Again, Salesforce is very easy to change. That's the positive. The downside is it's very easy to change. And with that level of power comes a level of responsibility. So let me just move on to the third area, which is about documentation. And this is where I suck all the energy out of the room. Nobody wants to do documentation, even I don't. There are 4 types of documentation. I think people always think about, I've got to go and write down everything I've done. I've got to go and build a spreadsheet of all that information, or stick it in a wiki, or stick it in a quick document. And you really know that nobody's ever going to read it. I think the very, very important word here is context. You need to understand that bit of metadata and the documentation in the context of, say, where that metadata item is used. I could go into an org and probably tell you what has been changed, but what I need is, why has it been changed? What was in your mind when you made that change? Why did you build this thing that looks like Path when Path already exists? Well, maybe at the time you built it, Path wasn't you hadn't migrated to Lightning, and therefore you couldn't use Path. So that documentation of why we did it is really valuable. And again, for many, many organizations, that documentation is being written, it just never gets captured and linked anywhere useful. So I want to go through the 4 different types of documentation. The first is the stuff that's really easy. You don't have to do anything at all. You can use the APIs to automatically build documentation. The where used, tell me what this metadata item is. It's a pick list. What are the pick list values? Oh, this is a process builder workflow and it's not active. That's the sort of level of documentation you can get out very quickly because it comes through the APIs. The second that's easy is maybe there's pre-built process maps, pre-built config information that's coming from you, the consultant, or from you, the ISV, that you can simply put into the org. So you may be an expert in, say, field service Lightning for the oil and gas industry. You've got a ton of IP, process content that you've built, you've understood how you've configured Salesforce for that particular industry. That's content that you can bring to the customer. In a couple of clicks, you can get it installed into an org. Suddenly, that pre-built documentation is there. If you're an ISV, maybe there's documentation about your package, like, do not change this field. If you change this field, it will break everything. That's the sort of documentation that's critical to making sure that you're getting to value for your customers very quickly. Second level of documentation is linking stuff you already have. You've created requirements, great, link it to the metadata items. You've created a user story, great, link it to the metadata item. You've drawn some process maps, great, link those to the process document to the metadata items. Suddenly I'm building up a history of why those changes got made. I can see a list of all the user stories that touch this metadata item. Or I can see some conflicts. Wow, this metadata item has been changed 3 times, but it's also involved in 2 releases from 2 different groups, and they're actually conflicting. So back to my discover the bad news early from the very first point, understand collecting those user stories, connecting them to metadata items gives you some early warning of potential issues. And then the hard stuff is manually writing things down. But fine, write it in text, dictate it to Siri, take a photograph of a whiteboard and attach it. You've already built a specification, link it. So we need to find some nice ways of creating this documentation. So just here, back to that picture I had where we built this data dictionary using the APIs, I can now link, and this is the first piece where it's already building information about where the dependencies are. So this earned value field is used in 7 page layouts, 3 reports, 3 validation rules. This is simply using the metadata APIs. Secondly, we could link that earned value field to the 2 user stories. So I can see one's in design and one's ready for implementation. That may be okay, that may be a risk, but at least I'm now building up a history of the change, and then that user story has got a lot more information associated with it. So I've got some history that I can connect. And then finally, I could link to, a note, a whiteboard session, a photograph. I could link to, a URL. Maybe I can link to, I could link to a process diagram. Again, all of this is easier if you've built a metadata dictionary for your customer, or you're using a metadata dictionary from one of the products out there. Elements.cloud and others. But you shouldn't be relying on spreadsheets to try and make this stuff work when there's so much capability out there in the ecosystem. So, got a few minutes left. Just thinking about the key takeaways. The first is that clearly Salesforce is now a strategic application. Even if it's being used in the smallest non-profit, the data that's being held there is critical to the effective operation of that company. So it's strategic. The power of Salesforce is the flexibility and the agility. We need to make sure we don't lose that. And as it says there, we're seeing now the complexity of orgs is actually killing that agility. And it's increasing the risk of making changes. It also increases the risk of every project you go into as either a consultant or as an ISV. And as I said, the scale of orgs now means that you really need to rely on those APIs to do that analysis for you. It's impossible to think you can do it manually and keep it up to date. And the last point is that analysis and documentation surely should be baked into the implementation, not an afterthought. So Salesforce can't be managed by hope and spreadsheets. We need to have a more rigorous approach. And I think we're seeing that a lot more. We're running Center of Excellence round tables, which are being hugely well attended because people are now starting to put in place the disciplines that, and I've seen in my 20 years in Salesforce, but also 10 or 15 years before that in Accenture, that we were using an SAP, Oracle, those big on-premise applications. Some of the disciplines we're seeing from there are now being applied in a more agile way, in a more cloud approach way, but being applied to Salesforce. So I promised you some resources. I also wanted to leave you with some actionable next steps. It's all very well listening to these presentations, and fantastic. You go away excited, motivated, but you don't leave with any actions. So I think that the first action is witness the power of using UPN to engage your clients. Go and start looking at this new process mapping approach that's being introduced into Salesforce as a way of engaging clients, validating requirements, and building out some great user stories. So that's the first thing. The second is embed a methodology for org discovery at the very front end of your implementation. So make sure that you're doing the analysis, you're doing your org discovery up front, and have a formal approach for that which is consistent across your practice. And the last is harder, but I think is still achievable, is talk to your customers about making sure that documentation is a paid deliverable. Now we've got a customer literally this week has gone back to their consulting firm and said, I don't care what you document in, but by the time you have left, all the documentation will be in the Elements Metadata Dictionary. Be very clear about that. You are not finished on your project, and I don't care whether you pay for it or you do it for free, but part of the statement of work is that the documentation will be in a metadata dictionary so we can manage it. Do not leave us with a pile of spreadsheets and a couple of Visio diagrams and think you're done. And I think more and more customers are thinking that way. So some links there for you. There's a business process mapping course on the Partner Learning Camp, which you can get to. We've created an org discovery process. Again, there's no cost to using that. It's all about free tools. There's the article there about 10 lessons from analyzing 7 billion metadata items, and the article that started this all off, which was the 3 golden rules. I'll leave you with one last thought. People say, okay, we're a non-profit, we're a higher ed, we don't have budget for this, whatever you're talking about is going to be too expensive. I can tell you that, I don't know what the cost of other applications are, but Elements is, for a consultant, is $500 per consultant per year. And you can apply this sort of principles to every one of your customers. So even the lowest budget implementation surely can afford to save a day of your time for the cost of a license for a year. And I think it's very easy for us as consultants or as ISVs to go, we've got to look for free tools because the client can't afford it. And we don't really look to the true return on investment and the effort that can now be saved with some of the tools that are out there, and also the automation that's available with the power of the APIs. So I've got about 5 or so minutes for questions if anybody's got some. Question just came in about non-profits don't have a budget to do this. What can you see or recommend to make that case? I would go back actually to the document called the 3 Golden Rules, because actually in that document we've built out how you build the business case, and it gives you some various ideas about where to look for the numbers, and then some idea about how some hard calculations that says if you put this number in here, this is the ultimate cost. So I think we need to help non-profits particularly understand the cost of using free versus the cost of using tools. Sometimes free is the right answer, but again, it's all about building that business case and making sure you pick the right tool for the right job. I wrote an article that said free is not free, and that article is not about saying you can't use free, you have to pay for tools, but it's about balancing the risk and the rewards of using free. Someone asked me, could I go back to that very first picture, and so we can actually have that, so you can take a photograph of that QR code so you can get to the document. So let's find it for you. Okay, so there's the QR code. You can take a photograph of that one. That will take you to this presentation, a deck, but also the presentation I'm about to give in 2 minutes' time, talking about 10 lessons from 7 billion metadata items. So if there are no more questions, let me just summarize this, which is Salesforce has the opportunity to give us an enormous ROI. I think as consultants and ISVs, we need to make sure that we think about the best approach for implementing change and take advantage of the tooling out there so we can accelerate that, as Salesforce call it, time to business value.